Hey everybody, this is Kevin Dawidowicz from CoachMePlus, and you're listening to episode 2 of the CoachMePlus Applied Sports Science podcast. Make sure you guys go to CoachMePlus.com and join our newsletter for the latest on applied sports science, but also make sure to subscribe to this podcast. We'll be doing this about every 2 weeks. It is Thursday, June 2nd, 2016. We are on location at Leaders in Performance Summit in New York City. You can go to leadersinsport.com to learn more. If you guys have never been to one of these events before, I really recommend it. There's nothing more professional when it comes to what these guys do. I don't know how they get the guests that they do, but they had general managers, they had people from NASA, they had some military guys. They blended in different types of coaches. So at one point there was a Premier League soccer coach up with a chess coach and a fencing coach, all explaining their different experiences in youth sport. So they do it about twice a year now. I think they had one in LA last spring, and of course the summit in New York City. They also have one in London, but honestly, it's one of the best events that we go to. So again, leadersinsport.com. It's not a plug for them, but it's just our honest opinion that I think it's really good. So today on the podcast, we have Chris West, the Associate Head Strength Coach at the University of Connecticut, and Megan Young, really good friend of ours, Strength Coach at Auburn University. It's interesting. This is one of those conversations that began in the hallway before we decided to make it a podcast. We were actually sitting around and discussing some thoughts on applied science and limitations and things like that. And I said, okay, you know what? We have to stop and actually record this. This is our first group podcast, so please bear with us with any kind of noise issues. I think about halfway during the podcast, somebody came in and started setting up glasses for the event that was happening later on, and it basically sounds like Christmas in the background. So bear with the noise issues. I promise we'll try and take care of it either with better microphones or something like that next time. So without further ado, welcome Chris West and Megan Young to the CoachMePlus Applied Sports Science podcast. We are at Leaders in Performance, and we've got Megan Young and Chris just in a conversation in the hallway, and it was a very natural conversation about problems that we're facing with load variables, fatigue variables, and everything else like that. And I yelled out, "We need to stop right now," and basically start recording this other podcast, which we're here for. So pardon the grainy video and probably noisy background, but I think we got about an hour before the next session breaks out. You guys want to do a quick intro, Megan? Who you are and what
This
you do?
is Chris West. He's at UConn. He's the Director of Sports Science.
Auburn.
Magician. Yeah. So basically, we're getting into the problem that you guys are facing with, and we can totally get natural and relax. I don't want to be interviewee. The problems that you guys are facing with understanding what we saw in the last session, where somebody was tracking different data points, but they were using it to explore the questions, right? Like not really being able to actually get into answers without being able to look at it. And Chris, you mentioned that what you can deal with and what you can't deal with as far as data.
Yeah, I think what we were talking about was just the data-driven versus hypothesis-driven.
Yep.
And there's lots of technology out there that gives us the ability to capture data when we don't necessarily have a question of what we're trying to answer,
Yep.
Versus having a specific question and finding the right technology to answer that question.
Yep.
And so I think where the conversation was going was that what are the basic qualities, regardless of the current state of technology that can measure, workload or strain or stress, and regardless of the current state of technology that can measure, fatigue or recovery. How do we define these categories so that when a new technology comes along, we can say, okay, this is a better way to measure or capture the information that we're trying to get, rather than being reactive to, the market of
Influx of technology.
Yeah, that meaningful stays relatively meaningful. Now, we may ask different questions along the way, and maybe ask better questions and questions that take us deeper into understanding the type of thing we're looking for. But I think that the basic concepts of measuring stress and stress response are constant. How we measure those things may vary, but those basic things are constant.
And understanding that not all stresses are equal. Understanding that a mechanical stress versus a velocity stress versus an internal stress versus an academic stress, those cause different responses, and being able to not predict those responses, but predict the stress.
But you're kind of like jumping ahead to the conclusion. Like if I'm exploring something for the first time and I don't know the difference between academic stress and metabolic stress, where do you begin? Like what top level of data capture do you even start with?
You got to ask what the problem is.
Right.
So within sport, business, science, unless there is a problem, there is no need to do research. Now, we're in the great situation that there's lots of problems, right? Because we work with 18 to 22-year-olds, 23, 25, whatever. But lifestyle issues, performance decrements, lack in performance gains, wins, losses, recruiting, talent identification, talent acquisition, keeping talent, academic success, personal success. All those things are problems that we're just trying to engage with and cause a communication standard for and assess to push them forward and therefore push our product forward. And our product is our student athlete. And when you drive that student athlete in a positive direction in all these platforms, then your whole department is driving forward.
Yeah. Okay. So with if you're starting off and you have to communicate why this is important to other decision makers, right now you've got a coach who's yelling at you saying, the kids all look tired today, or why do they look slow? How do you turn load and fatigue and tracking of information into a way that you can communicate to this guy that what's basically happening?
I think that's kind of what this whole leaders conference has been about. You listen to the chief knowledge officer of NASA to all these different people from Tour de France winners and everything else, and what you hear is it always goes back to relationships and it always goes back to people.
Yeah.
And I heard a really strategic patience.
Yeah, I like that one.
Is really tough, right? Because you may know the best thing or think you know the best thing to help this team. Mm-hmm. But what you haven't done is lay down the best framework to implement that. And the best thing to do is have a relationship with those decision makers. And if the decision maker knows you care, knows you're confident, knows you're qualified, and that you're going to be consistent with whatever you're doing, then that relationship will evolve over time. So I think understanding what their need is, what does the decision maker think their need is? If they think their team needs to be more fit, help them get their team more fit, then show them what fitness and fatigue look like compounded together.
Sure.
And so you meet them at their area of interest and then push them forward outside of that.
What's your experience been like when you're trying to communicate to the position or to the team coach who's saying, I need to know what's going on?
Right. Yeah. Again, it's a great question. I think that's kind of the fundamental thing that we need to start with, identifying what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Why are we here?
This. Yeah. And a big thing we talk about performance, and I think. Simple enough to say that if we look at the extreme end of malperformance or poor performance, and we talk about injury and player availability, I think this is a fundamental factor that if we can, number one, the lifeblood of any program is the recruiting and the talent that you have. So if you can keep that talent healthy, right, and fit, then you've got a chance to be pretty good. But if you're it's all about stress tolerance. So if you can develop a stress tolerance within your athletes, that they can tolerate the stress demands of the sport, then you're able to be successful. And if you get to a point where they're acutely or chronically that you're unable to tolerate that stress that's put on them, then you end up with injuries, basically.
Or inhibition.
Yeah. So I think one of the big things is being able to talk to the coaches about how do we, number one, minimize the risk of injury. Right, through training, and this is, I think, one of the benefits of monitoring this training load is we can see, what's too much, Well, that's a little bit of a question right now, right?
Yeah. And, you wanted to explore the question. That's kind of what sparked this whole, let's go record this. The confusion, the confusion that's like out there with every. I just got a paper delivered to me from some company trying to sell me some stuff, and it was a research on wearable devices over the next 15 years or whatever, or 10 years, whatever it was. Anyway, long story short, they had 427 different device companies that's in our space. That's everybody from Catapult to Whoop to SportsView down to 100 different device companies I never even heard of. So, and I do this for a living where I monitor all this stuff and try to watch all this tech. I can't even imagine what it's like for you guys. Like, how do you deal with getting inundated with the next cool wearable, the next cool tech, whatever it might be? And how do you make a decision that says, I need to use this to monitor load or fatigue or something new?
Yeah, I mean, for me, that's what I'm trying to wrap my brain around at this point in time is how do we define what are categories that we want to measure and that we want to track. Certainly stress is one of them. Well, what are we going to use to monitor that stress or that training load? And, well, right now we're going to use what we have. We have GPS. We have heart rate. We've got the acceleration piece. What are we going to do to monitor that recovery piece or that fatigue piece? And, I think that you can look at, some of the things we talk about, the Whoop devices and the fatigue science, and you can look at sleep recovery, but we're making an assumption with that sleep recovery that has an effect on performance rather than measuring the performance.
Yeah.
So when we've talked about this, we've used vertical jump as kind of a standard to say, okay, well, how is your vertical jump change with your training loads over the course of a week to try to find a threshold where we see, okay, your vertical jump goes down because you've done too much, or potentially your vertical jump goes down because you haven't done enough and you've lost fitness. So I think it's trying to find that bandwidth to say because I don't think that there is an ideal singular amount, right?
Okay.
I don't think that you can put it on a single number. But I think there is a range of what you can measure and do from that standpoint. So, again, looking at the technologies that are out there, look, one of the new ones, the Nordboard, right?
Yeah.
Fascinates me.
It's one of my favorite new techs, by the way.
I mean, really cool. But taking that into consideration of what we're talking about, where does that fit in this paradigm? Is this a readiness tool that tells us an athlete's state of fatigue? Potentially.
Is it a return to play kind of tool? Like I've seen people use it in that mindset.
Yeah.
Or fatigue tool. Like, is the guy burned out? Like, they had two different use cases for the Nordboard. One was like an ISO hold, and the other one is the Nordic movement, which I get the name from. And if your athlete is injured, then the ISO strength should be your return to play indicator before you actually move into the next phase of your return to play protocol. And it's a great unit for one use case, but how does that tie into other things that you're doing? Is that the thing that you're going to test, or like you said, is it going to be vertical jump?
Right. And I think the other thing, when we talk about monitoring and we talk about all this stuff, is there are some questions brought up, like who owns that data?
Yeah.
Is that the athlete's data? Is that the school's data? Is it the broadcasting rights data?
Yeah.
And then what are we actually doing with that data? Are we just collecting it? Are we giving all this data to that athlete? And then in the college, the main talks in NCAAs and among universities is this whole student-athlete wellness.
Yep.
Like, what are we doing with these kids in their lives? Like, Are they practicing too much? Are we putting too much demand on them? Are we, following all these parameters? And do we have a correct structure in place? Is the system right? And hopefully what we're trying to answer and hypothesize is, can we help increase wellness?
Yeah.
And overall experience, so that when they leave their university setting, and whether it's to go pro or go into business or take my job, then they've had an experience and such that's been positive, but we've also enabled them with these lifestyle parameters so that they can go out and be productive citizens.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of it from the athlete educational standpoint is bringing awareness to the process, bringing awareness to the process of training and recovery and the importance of both for them. Some of the devices like, for example, the Whoop giving you a readiness score based on your sleep, your depth of sleep and all the different parameters they use. But the reality is, how are we going to control that as a coach?
Well, if I go, hey coach, here's my HRV. You can't really see it.
9.6.
Yeah, which was great yesterday, but if you look at my scores the past couple of days, I did a lot of yard work and it was like in the 6s and 7s, so it was terrible. And then I woke up this morning and it's 9.6. Now, as a layman, I'm like, can I go run 100 miles? Is that what it's?
I think like HRV and all these readiness standpoints, Omega Wave, they're all fantastic tools, right?
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, we're not the ultimate decision maker. It is our job to communicate effectively based off of what we may have more experience in or experts in or whatever to the decision makers, give them the information and understand that it's multifactorial. Like it's HRV is one thing, right? And it shows you something. Can you tell me exactly what causes an HRV?
And that's where you start getting down to the mysticism of the device company. Because
or just the measure in general.
Well, right, but Catapult has player load odometer and so on. Yep. Polar has a player load, and we don't really know what those numbers mean. We just know that we trust in the company to tell us that they've developed these algorithms that give us a score. The recovery score from Whoop or from Omega Wave, it's broken down into a 0 through 10 scale or 8 scale. Or whatever. We're trusting that company has done the research to back the value, the variable that they're providing us. So. My question for you guys is, how much do you look at that with, complete trust, or do you use some skepticism?
I think it's smart to always be skeptical. There was a presenter today, and there's object-oriented approaches in data, right, and systems, and he had this disoriented object. And I thought that was really an interesting way to say that, because there's data, which is these devices, right, but then this other side, there's the experience, and that is people. And what we're trying to do with this data and these people is decrease speculation and have increased knowledge. So we may not know what's going to happen on a rainy day on a soccer field when we're playing a school that we always play, and then boom, there's this one unconfounding variable that we haven't accounted for. So I don't think the answer is to try and control all the uncontrollables and measure everything. I think the answer is going to be, when you look at the way hardware and software kind of goes and evolves, it's your iPod and your cell phone merged and became the iPhone. Well, in 10 years, hopefully, some of these metrics and things that we're measuring become one thing, and now we're measuring less things, and that increases our wellness.
I think that how you deal with one specific data point, say we've got a training load that's extremely high, or we have a heart rate variability score that's too low, or any one of these things. I think in and of themselves, it's potentially a warning sign. But I think that at times, if we have a high heart rate load, we've got a high velocity load, we've got a low HRV score. When these things start painting the same picture, that potentially gives us more information. But again, this kind of begs the question of selecting the right technology to answer the right question. So looking at that training stress and looking at that recoverability of that response to that training stress. How many of these things, like going back to the Nordboard example, is this potentially, this is not a primary
function.
Primary function. Maybe it's a secondary function. And I use the analogy, and I think we talked about this the other day, of going through the airport. The airport security. Where, the first thing you do when you go through airport security is you go through and you put your hands up and they scan you. Now, if something shows up on there, they take you aside and they wand you down. Now, if they can't figure it out with the wand, then they do your hands or they take you in the back room. But, that concept for what we're trying to look at with a readiness score or with a load score, we may see a readiness score that, and let's say it's a vertical jump. So we take them through, we do the vertical jump. It's very simple. We see that vertical jump is down. Well, if it's not down, great. Go on and go do your thing. But if it's down, now we can take those individuals and maybe investigate a little bit further. Maybe we do a Nordboard at that point. Maybe we do a heart rate variability at that point. But maybe there are secondary and tertiary tests to lead us in a better direction. But in general, for the most part, one of the big problems with a lot of this technology is the time investment that it takes to capture this information.
Oh, sure.
So if we're going to Nord board everybody, right, and it takes you 2 to 3 minutes, if you're going to get a heart rate variability on everybody and they don't have something to take home with them, it's going to take you 5 minutes. For a team of 30 guys, this starts becoming a huge investment of time that we just don't have.
And that goes back to the student athlete too. And if you do all of these things with a freshman all the time, what have you taught them, right? And this becomes their norm. Like, I think that you can start off with very simple things, like you're saying. These are our primary things that we will always do, and we can hang our hat on research-wise. And over time, we know acutely we may get a view of something, but chronically, if we see that same picture happening, that has more statistical power to us. So we feel more confident in that decision based off that data. But when we go into recovery layers and recovery modalities and all these technologies, maybe we add them based on educational components and on secondary and tertiary needs. So, these are the primary functions. This athlete has shown success and does all these things that we ask of them, hold them accountable for it. And then that's what the Minnesota Vikings GM said when he interviewed, I think, 47 of the 53 players. The number one thing they wanted in a head coach was someone to hold them accountable on and off the field. So I think that can be said across the board, that we should want athletes that want to be held accountable. And when you do that and they earn something, there's something to be said for earning that.
We remember when, I think it was Eric Corum had his earn the next level of monitoring.
Yeah, I was not, but that's exactly what I mean.
Have you seen that?
No.
So he presented this case, and he goes, the first level of monitoring was CoachMePlus, like it was daily wellness questionnaires. If you've proven that you can do that, then you get to the next level of monitoring, which was, I think it was like maybe a sleep monitor. No, the sleep monitor was like the last step.
Like basically heart rate or something?
Yeah, heart rate, and then it was GPS, and then it was a sleep monitor. So it was like you were leveling up.
Yeah, exactly.
So you prove that you can do it, and it's like you have to earn the sleep monitor, you have to earn the GPS.
Maybe we have to educate this athlete in 3 different ways that we didn't want to because their vertical jump is going down, but we finally get to the point that this is the thing they connect with, this is the thing they understand. It's also like finding the metric that matters to a head coach.
If you think about, we're talking about training stress balance and session RP variable, and you need a time series to look at it against. Session RPE, you need a load series and a time series, like a session time. So does my session time come from, me standing there with a stopwatch? Does it come from me asking the athlete how long did you work out? Did it come from my wearable device? Did it come from the time on ice? Like, where does that information come from? And it really doesn't matter because it's just simply a variable, right? Like, that's what we're...
As long as it's constant.
Well, we run into that a lot, where people are like, well, my in-season is this, my off-season is this.
The sports scientist in me says Z-score. I think if you really want valid decisions and you can hang your hat on those decisions, then first you have to start off with normalization of data collection. Yeah. And what is your process? So it does need to be the same, and we're not saying the session has to have the same duration or we expect the same load, but the way you get the data should be the same. And just like the way I always put the weight on the bar is going to be the same, the way I always put the weight on the bar, the way I should put on my device before practice and take it off after practice should always be the same, barring natural disaster.
But let's play devil's advocate. I went out and I spent a lot of money on my Omega Wave units.
Yep.
And I get my budget whacked, and I have to decide between heart rate variability and nutrition, and we're not going to cut the food, so we're going to keep the food budget. Instead, I tell everybody to go get an app, and we're going to do it that way.
Yeah.
Is all my Omega Wave data invalid, or do I renormalize it for my new data capture?
That's a great question, Chris. I'll let you talk it first.
If you look at the difference between, say, a Catapult device or the Polar Team Pro or, a Stat Sports device, they're all capturing speed, distance, acceleration parameters.
Yep.
Right? So we should be able to, across these things, to express and keep consistent from one device to another. Now, if the devices are not accurate compared to each other, then that potentially creates a problem.
Right. But they should paint the same picture.
Yeah, but they should paint the same picture. Now, with the heart rate variability piece, how would you, if you can't do heart rate variability, and so you do, you do the app and you're using a different algorithm and a different method, you don't necessarily have that raw data of speed, distance, acceleration to be able to go and manipulate to come up with your answer. And I think this is a problem in the field in the fact that, and maybe it's a problem for a good financial reason, is that, look, if you can only get this number from this unit, then your incentive to change units may be,
But I think the technology is never going to. It's never. Well, I think that the technology is never going to stop. Right? It's going to keep evolving. It's going to keep changing. How do you guys deal with that? Yeah. That's.
I mean, I think, like he's saying, the variable should stay the same. If the tech gets better, great, right? But we can't sit here and say we shouldn't measure things because we know that the technology is going to get better. So it's like waiting. I'm not going to have a phone because I know the new iPhone's coming out. You still need a phone, right? So
you've run into syncing your contacts when you go from like an old device to a new device.
And it sucks, but it can be done.
It has to sync Facebook, and now it's got Instagram, and now it's got to sync, Snapchat. And you just run into like all these nightmares.
Let's say we use a device for 5 years, and let's say the next wave of technology and software and hardware upgrades, whatever, the trends that we've seen should be able to carry over to whatever new device is because they're just painting pictures of these categories. If we're using the raw data instead of relying on algorithms. And I think that's the conversation we're having, is maybe you should know what your own raw data is trying to paint for you instead of just relying on algorithms.
Well, we've dealt with that, right? Like we're taking, one thing that we worked on with you was actually taking the information and then coming up with your own load score based on acceleration zones and all this other stuff, right?
Right. Which makes things complicated. And I think this is the genesis of this whole conversation is that there are so many different ways that people measure, load, that people measure recovery, whether it's heart rate variability. I mean, all these different methods that I think that it becomes a very confusing picture for people that are starting to get interested in using technology. Because again, it becomes about the device, not the question. Not the question. So how do you get around that? That's a really good question, and I don't know if it's something that potentially trying to create a Z-score and normalizing data can give you. Now, when you change devices, it's going to take you another month to capture enough data points to get that
paint the other picture.
To paint that picture, but potentially that Z-score should be relatively comparable to what they've done.
And maybe that's what you do the research on, right? Maybe you look at the training load based on multiple devices and what is the percent difference across these devices and why. And then if those devices upgrade again, it's just collecting historical data and saying, we see this, right? I think that's when people said, if you play soccer and you're a female, you're going to tear an ACL, right? Well, now if you play sport, you're going to get hurt. Right, unless you monitor things. Good job, guys.
Yeah, we had to look back. GM say no human should be playing football. Like that came out. I was just like, oh, dude.
I'll just bypass that. I'll leave that. I mean, go Auburn football. But I think when you look at all these things, like Chris and I are saying, is what are the metrics that are important to you, and what are you actually trying to measure, and what conclusion are you trying to draw? Mm-hmm. If you're trying to draw a conclusion of thresholds, so for not doing too much and least effective dose so that you can do just enough, okay, cool. Yeah. And base it on physical parameters of either mechanical or metabolic load or whatever that may be, and then take into this aspect that we haven't even talked about of psychology, that those things should be able to be monitored no matter what the device is. And maybe it doesn't matter necessarily, statistically speaking, how much it changes from device to device. It just monitors that you've done it and that you recognize the change.
We had the NHL Combine had changed all of their testing parameters in the last 2 years. They went from doing it inside a facility that was not really set up for it. It was basically the hotel lobby kind of set. They had 5-10-5 drills on the carpet, and they moved over to a wood floor. They went from bench press that was at a specific weight to a percentage of the athlete's body weight. They went to watt bikes instead of the previous bikes. And we had a lot of teams ask us, hey, can we compare last year's data to this year's data? Well, what do you want to compare? Because it's not the same testing.
You could still rank people, like they're still doing an acceleration test, right? So you could still rank people based on how they did in the acceleration test. The test didn't matter, though.
Sure.
Right? I still finished first, right? And what was his acceleration speed? You could still know that information and then run it across historical data and say, he still is in the top 10% across the past 15 years, regardless of what the test was. So I think you could do something like that, but yeah, you need to state that the test was different.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it's interesting because again, some of the tests historically are tests that 5, 10, 5, and what are we looking for? We're looking for an athlete's ability to decelerate and accelerate, right? And we're using the 5, 10, 5 as a test to determine that when we can actually now measure their ability to accelerate and decelerate.
Right.
So the in some ways the tests have
Become a device.
Yeah, it's that I wonder if look, so it doesn't matter if we're able to measure their acceleration and deceleration. It doesn't matter if they're doing a 5, 10, 5 or a
Playing soccer.
Whatever it is, an L drill or let's call it whatever. But at the same time, then if you talk about just environmental conditions, doing it on a carpet versus a gym floor, there's maybe some issues with that.
And I mean, performance and testing is going to keep evolving, right? Like using force plates along with a vertical jump versus just a vertical jump, and then adding 3D motion analysis. We're always going to be taking in more to capture more, to look at more things at one time. It's kind of like NASA when they send up that satellite or whatever to Saturn. There was 19 projects on there in one mission.
Yeah.
So maybe there's 19 projects within our one jump that we're looking at. So we just need to understand that, though.
Well, it was interesting with the NHL because they moved from the vertical jump hitting the
Vertex
versus to a force plate, and they used the force plate's predicted jump height for.
And the jumps went down tremendously.
I'd have to take a look at it, and actually I'd take a look at data. But the interesting part was that they, like you're saying, 19 projects with one test. Like with the jump on a force plate, you could do all kinds of.
There's testing. A lot of data within that, yeah.
Right. But all they wanted to do for this first step was like transition from jumping at a stick to, actually doing it on a force plate, and maybe later on we'll actually be able to get rate of force development or other variables off of that, so you can actually do some other types of testing. But I think it was like that first baby step into the next transition. And some coaches loved it, and some coaches just hated it. We're changing the methods, we're changing the ways we're tracking it, and it's going to screw up all of my historic information.
Well,
blah,
if
blah,
people
blah.
aren't part of innovation, then why do they have that insecurity? So if that insecurity is because innovation takes away from their own job security, that's one thing, right? But if innovation is not happening, like a lot of the people are talking here, how are we actually getting better? And what are we actually trying to get better at?
Sure.
So.
Yeah, I think this kind of brings us around to the fundamental concept that we started talking about was what is it that we are looking to measure, not how are we going to measure it. I certainly see some problems with, look, if we had to change our iPhones every month because technology was upgrading that fast, and I'm sure that it does, but they don't release an iPhone every month. They'll wait and release it over a period of time. But there's still some consistency. So, again, getting back to the how do we go from a vertical jump on a vertex to a force plate, and how do we make that comparison? It is really an interesting question because I can certainly respect the fact that you're all of a sudden losing all your historical data, and now you're starting over. And we're going to do that for a period of time until the next thing comes along, and then we lose all that historical data. So, again, I think it comes down to what is the fundamental piece that we're measuring. If we're looking at power output, and we do it through a vertex, or we do it through a jump force plate, or we do it through, but power output would be the potentially the least common denominator, the basic fundamental measure, not necessarily jump height.
Sure.
Right? Because my guess is that having done vertex in the past historically with our team and moving to force plates and then going to a just jump mat, I don't know what's good anymore. You know what I mean? So I respect that, the fact that you can look at, the thing of testing, look at the 40-yard dash. If somebody runs a 4.5, we can all say that's a pretty good number.
Well, look at the 40-yard dash and say, they used to run it on dirt, then they ran it on, soft turf, and then they got shoes, and then now you got Usain Bolt wearing like the techiest of shoes on, the fastest of tracks.
And they used to use stopwatches, and now they have a timing system and all these other things. Yeah.
So the technology is going to evolve, and I guess we just got to.
And I think the technology is trying to reduce human error too,
Yeah.
right? Like stopwatch versus timing system.
Sure.
But then within technology, how do we get rid of user error as well? Like within wearing a device and, I didn't clip it all the way on, or I didn't turn it on before I walked inside and back outside.
We're going to have user error with this. Like we're here podcasting and the microphone in the background. Like I don't even know if this is capturing the right way.
Yeah.
So we're gonna get to the end of this and be like, oh, that was great. It didn't really do anything.
But I think the retrospective question of like losing data, and someone brought it up in one of the talks, somebody smarter than me, and they were saying, we didn't know to look at this until we tracked it for a long time and it popped out that it mattered. So
what was the?
I don't remember what it was, but it was in business strategy, not in athletics. So, but that happens, right? Like until you look at something over a long time, maybe that wasn't initially part of the question we were asking, but it was a byproduct that we happened to capture at the same time, and then you have that aha moment 18 months down the road, and you go, "Oh wait, that mattered." Well, at least you captured that data, so now that you can have thresholds or parameters based upon it, or know to look at that more intently. Sure. And that's the point we're at with this technology, is looking at so many things and waiting for the right one to pop out, right? But there is no magical algorithm to get everything. Like even in crowdsourcing, they're looking at all these things, and they're saying with Apple, they're producing what was the number, like 470,000 apps a day or a minute or an hour or something ridiculous. There's no way that you could sit here and say, I measure everything, we're good. Right? Like so being human with that and discussing what the limitations are to your decision makers and just making them aware, and NASA has a good way of doing that, is a mishap. Is it something that went wrong or something that we didn't collect, but it did not change the performance outcome? Is it a mistake? Did it change the performance outcome? And then is it a failure? Did we repeatedly make the same mistake?
Interesting. I think, I mean, the amount of pressure, though, that comes down on you guys to provide the value for the cost that you guys are incurring when you're looking at this stuff. So somebody says, hey, there's some new tech, I want to do some testing with it. Now all of a sudden you guys are held to the fire to actually produce results. How do you guys handle the transition from, I just want to test this stuff for a year or two before we actually, use it, whereas a coach is saying, no, I want results now?
I think it depends a lot upon your administrators and your support structure and your head coach's support. Like, are they getting this device because they want the answer now, or because they know this device is important to have? Or is it getting it so that we have it to say that we have it for recruiting? Like, those are all very real things. Too, and so then within that, like, a point was brought up, a NASA short-term project is 5 years. Well, that student-athlete is graduated and now is in grad school, and so our time infrastructure is a lot shorter, for sure. And then you look at turnover within athletics at the college level. So I don't really know how to answer that question and say, yep, everything's fine, or no, don't do it because you don't know how long you're going to be somewhere.
Yeah, I have a real, not a real problem, but I do have a problem with this concept, and let's just take it down to a financial investment standpoint, because look, we're going to make an investment in technology. We do want to see relatively immediate returns on it.
Yeah.
We don't want to, go on and what the other thing is a lot of the companies are going to lease programs now, right, rather than outright purchasing.
So that if their hardware upgrades, you get the upgrades.
Yeah, but at the same time, on a lease program, what you're doing is you're taking that lease over, let's call it 3 years. Well, what do the companies tell you? Well, it's going to take you at least a year or two of data capture to actually get any meaning for this. So actually, in this investment that you're making over a 3-year lease, you're not getting any return on it until the 3rd year. You're not getting any. So I have a little bit of problem with the fact that people say, well, you just have to capture the data and just wait, and
It's
eventually
paying for your car for 2 years and then getting it in the 3rd year.
Yeah.
That's painful.
That doesn't make a lot of sense, right?
Well, I mean, even as a software, sales guy, we open up our platform and we tell people like, yeah, you can explore the data and everything else like that. And the reality is, like, you're not going to get to the answers any faster. It's still going to take you the same amount of time. The only rabbits I pull out of my hat are like, well, you can get immediate value from like daily weigh-ins and question. Like, you can get immediate value the first day. There's a bunch of things you can do in daily testing. There's a bunch of stuff in about 7 to 10 days that you can get value out of, like looking at acute and chronic weight loss. And then, you just build like this story of how long does it take before I actually get value out of it. So we always try to push the immediate value along with the long-term value. And it's really hard to do because people, I want everything right now, and I want to be able to look at, regression analysis of these data points and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, you don't have enough data yet.
Well, I think one thing, too, is like, okay, so one thing I've personally experienced is the number of things you do consistently every day. And my number went from like doing 200 consistent things a day to like 0. And you don't realize that until it's at 0. And you're like, oh my gosh, I did so many things every day. Like I brushed my teeth, I took a shower, I, wrote something down. I did all these things. I made coffee, I got in my car, I drove. And then you realize like, man, that's a lot. And so that can be kind of overwhelming. And the same thing happens like in this process, right? How do I build this system? Well, so you choose that thing to start with and make it simple, like asking people how they feel or RPE, and then you do that consistently, and then you add this layered approach, and it's kind of like what you were talking about with Eric and adding things they've earned, but and explaining to people the limitations of the things you're adding and why you're waiting, and so kind of that strategic patience that is somewhat dumbing to us, like we hate to wait because we want to just do all these things and capture all of this information, but sometimes what best serves the institution and has the best return on investment are the things that you can do right now for free, and then add the complexities on top of that to get the bigger picture.
I think one of the potential ways that we can take some of this new technology, and I'll just use it from a training load standpoint, is that you're going to get different algorithms that give you different outputs and different arbitrary units.
Sure.
So if you look at say a catapult player load of 1,000, right, and a polar training load of 350.
Yep.
Those don't have much meaning without context.
Correct.
And so I think one of the things that you can do, at least with the training load piece, is, for example, put it into a match equivalent.
Yeah.
Saying that an average soccer match is 1,000 points. An average, match from a heart rate standpoint is 350 points. So now we're able to take that information and say, okay, well, versus that 1,000-point level, I'll give you the quick example. We were doing a heart rate with Polar years ago, 10 years ago, with this old team system. And, we had some of our players get a training load of 2,700 points in 4 days. Now, that doesn't really mean anything until you put into context that a match is 350 points. So we'd done the equivalent of playing 7 matches in 4 days of preseason. Wow. So that provides some context to say that, okay, 2,700, what does that number mean? Well, we have to wait a couple years to find out. Well, if we look at that match equivalent level, now we put it next to something that's comparable.
And you can do that with all the other metrics as well. So
now the one thing that's questionable, though, I'm wondering about, and I'm interested to hear if you guys have any feedback on this one, though, is from a training load standpoint, I think we can put like a match equivalent to compare it to something. But from a recovery standpoint, if we're looking at a heart rate variability versus a sleep score versus a resting heart rate versus how do we put that into context? What do we compare that to?
I think that becomes an interesting thing because, like we're saying, if we look at that training load, that's just giving us that load number, but within that, there is that volume load, there is that mechanical load or metabolic load that helps us kind of see, like, is this going to be soreness? Is this going to be tired? Is this going to be, okay? And then from that, does that give you insight into which recovery mode matters more? and getting a match equivalent. So like if we know that volume load is extremely high and we can predict some hamstring soreness, then we see no hamstring soreness the next day in a questionnaire, then we've done okay. Whereas if we're worried about central nervous system, fatigue and response, parasympathetic, sympathetic shift, maybe it's an omega wave response we care about more. And determining that based on match equivalence of the percentages or acute chronic over time with those things.
That, I'm wondering if there's like people screaming at their whatever the unit they're listening on right now. I got this thing, it's great. I'll do like a feedback thing so we can actually capture all that. We got about a few minutes left here, so you have throw out a hypothetical. You have no budget. It's hypothetical for everybody, or reality for everybody. You have no budget. You have like a few things that you can get down to. You have like 5 minutes with each athlete, both pre or post. What would you track? What would you do on a daily basis?
Yeah, well, answer that jumps to the forefront of my mind, and I don't know if it's definitely my strong opinion, but I think that probably the context of what I understand as the opinion out there would be an RPE scale, would be asking the athlete, what is your soreness level, what is your fatigue level, directly asking them. I think sometimes that's also what this data can help us do. Look, if I see somebody with a decreased vertical jump score, if I see somebody with a, if we're doing the Nord board and I see an asymmetry in there, do I act on that right away? Or do I go and I talk to them and say, hey, how you doing?
Yep.
If I see somebody with a high training load score, does that mean they're tired? Not necessarily. I may go talk to them and they may say, no, I'm doing great. Okay, well, we're going to watch it. So, back to what technology, would you use? I think the basic thing is what do we want to know, right? How did you sleep? How do you feel? Let's ask them, right? That's free, And so if we ask them now, there are other things that we can do to measure that and potentially to predict. Like if we say that, hey, this guy's really sore, well, why is he sore? Now, if we had the technology to go back and say, well, gee, this guy did 1,500 meters of high-intensity distance yesterday. Now, I know he's going to be sore from that. Now this becomes a little bit more of a predictive analysis to say that, okay, at least we know 1,500 is too high, right? So that we can go from there. But I think, what we're trying to get at with all this stuff is to find out the state of readiness, the state of fitness, the state of fatigue of our athletes. And the most simple way to do that is to ask them.
Love that. So you've got 5 minutes, and you can't use questionnaire because Chris took it from you.
Sure. I think I would, if I want to remove even the student athlete from the equation, is just observing in the practices and helping build that exercise practice drill library for our coaches and helping understand what their practices are like in a match equivalent. Like, this is hard. How hard is this drill? And that's where you could ask the athlete or the coach even.
Yeah.
And then just writing out some simple things. How big was the size of the field? Was there a change of direction? Was it program? Was it reactive? What was the speed level like? Were they walking, jogging, sprinting? Coming up with your own algorithm if you want, and say a game is a 10 and this was a 9, and how long they did it. So now you have a drill intensity, and then building that out for your coaches. That's where I started.
Yeah. Yeah, so you basically end up with a library of different types of practices, so you can
and volumes
work
and
with the coach and
intensities.
say,
It's like being a strength coach.
Yeah, that's great. So we've got, like I said, we got like 5 minutes here. Anything good that came out of the sessions that you saw today?
Yeah, boy, a lot. Just what I always love about leaders is listening to people that are outside of the sport industry in particular. I think that we tend to feel, at least sometimes I sit in my office and behind my computer and I'm trying to come up with a way to look at something that I feel is unique to sport performance. When the reality is that statistics and algorithms and predictive analysis have been done for years in other industries. So it's kind of cool to hear some of these other people come out and say, hey, you know what, performance is, there's a similarity between performance, whether you're talking about industry or NASA or athletics. There are some fundamental common denominators. And I think that in the world of all of the new innovation, the technology, I think that is what I'm trying to come up with, is what are those common denominators rather than reacting to a new technology. Well, where does this technology fit in the structure, in the framework of things?
Sure. What was your takeaway so far today?
I would just say that it all goes back to the driving force is not technology, it's people.
Yep.
And the innovation comes from people. So when you make your investment in people, then you're probably going to always win. And probably going to always going to win.
Yep.
Because that is an investment with a return of nothing else. It increases a network, becomes a relationship, and you don't know if that's going to lead to a potential job for you, or you potentially giving that person a job down the road because they end up being a resource that you must have.
Sure.
And it's really cool to hear NASA and some of these other places that are taking people that maybe retire and putting them with the newest interns.
Yeah.
It's kind of a mentorship thing. And
that.
I think that it's not to force an education upon them, it's to be a resource to them. And with this new generation and how they learn and how they ask questions and their opinions willing to be heard, I think that doing so puts you ahead of the curve instead of saying, do it the way the system has always been done. So it's interesting.
Cool. I think it's kind of funny when you mentioned coming across different businesses. This guy from Deloitte who was up there, and towards the end of the session, he said, we've got this thing where we track the amount of travel a guy does, how many nights he spends in a hotel, and I think there was like one other number, and he goes, if we get 3 of those flagged, then we make the guy stay home. And I was like, it's something so simple, we tell his boss he needs to check him out or something.
And they talked about this idea of the corporate athlete, right?
Yeah.
And we measure all this wellness and monitoring. Do you do it? Do you answer your daily questionnaire, Chris? Because you might need to, and taking care of, and then even the general manager for the Hawks said it best with, if you take care of the people those people care about, then those people stay. And that's
pay them early, pay them a lot.
Pay them early, and make them feel valued, make them understand their value and their limitations, and then take care of them in the other factors.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Well, let's wrap this up. This was Chris West from UConn and Megan Young from Auburn. Thank you, guys.
No problem.
I'm hoping that people will forgive us for the background noise and everything else like that, but I'll do all the outro stuff afterwards and to bore you with all the announcements and everything else. But thank you guys for both doing this. It's pretty awesome.
Awesome. Enjoyed it.
Yeah. We'll definitely have to do it again. All right. Thanks, guys.
So that's a wrap, folks. I'd like to thank Chris West from University of Connecticut and Megan Young from Auburn University for being on the podcast. Everybody, remember to go to CoachMePlus.com to subscribe to your Applied Sports Science newsletter. And, of course, subscribe to the podcast in whatever app that it is that you're using. Soon we'll also be adding comments and other things to the podcast. We'd like to get your feedback on things as we're discussing. If you notice that we got to the end of the conversation and there's some open questions as to, what we could be doing to track the different monitoring things that we're discussing. So in the meantime, email me, kevin@coachmeplus.com, if you have any comments or anything else like that, so that we can help improve the experience, but also to continue the conversation, because that's what this is all about. This is about making sure that we're part of the experience and the conversation and what's going on in the world of applied sports science. Thanks again, and see you guys in 2 weeks.